Hello and welcome to Odessi's discussion panel, where we will be exploring the topic of closing the feedback loop between housing organisations and local authorities and their customers. My name is Rhiannon Gibbs. I'm one of the directors at Odessi Consulting, and I'll be hosting today's discussion. I'd like to start by thanking our panel of experts for joining us today, and in no particular order, I'd like to introduce Amelia Nicholas, Head of Client Partnerships at Society Works. Now, Society Works, if you've not heard of them, is a wholly owned subsidiary of My Society, the registered charity behind some very prominent open source civic technology. You probably use their sites even if you don't realise that you have, so check them out. I'd also like to introduce Sally Reader, who's an account manager at Society Works, but until recently worked for a very large transportation provider. Is that the right expression, Sally?
Or Highways Authority.
Highways Authority, excellent, but has first-hand experience of the issue that we are discussing today. I'd also like to introduce Jonathan Richards, Technical Support and Market Manager at London Borough of Bromley, and Jeanette Pinwell, who is Head of Tenancy Management for Golding Homes, who is a social landlord based in Kent. So, introductions done. This area of closing the feedback loop is something we're often asked to explore at Odessi. And unsurprisingly, we've had a lot of interest in this topic today. So I'd like to launch straight into our main discussion point, if I may, which is about that communication loop between residents and the housing organisation or local authorities. And typically less of an issue when it's about a specific resident, but far more problematic when it comes to reporting communal issues. The challenge in our experience is usually sort of twofold. Firstly, who is accountable and responsible for liaising with the customer, so communicating with them. But secondly, who is responsible for resolving the customer issue that gets raised. So I'd like to start by discussing the problem in a little more depth. So the problem first. And Sally, you worked for the large, sorry, what am I calling it?
Highways Authority.
Thank you. I'm going to make a note now. Highways Authority. Where both these issues would have been at play. Can you start by telling us about the problem where you worked, please?
So working in a large organisation, there is always the issue of knowing who is responsible for what. And not only knowing who is responsible for fixing a thing, but also once a customer makes a report, who is then responsible for updating that customer and advising them what's going on. The problem that we had to solve was that it was taking too long for a report to go from the point where the customer made it to the team that could fix it to the customer being updated. There were about 8 different stages to the feedback loop, which just made it take far too long, far too admin heavy. And also a problem we identified was that safety critical items were not being identified correctly and were not being passed over to the right team in a timely manner, which, as you can imagine, creates all kinds of problems.
Jonathan, can I jump to you at this point and say, you know, as a local authority, the range of issues a resident might be getting in touch with you about is vast, right? Can you tell us a little more about the problem that you had in Bromley? I know a lot of the people listening or watching this will be able to relate to them.
Quite often as a local authority, anything in the public realm sort of starts to fall within our remit, or you know, gets passed to us to sort of initiate investigation into that, and that can pose challenges when you've got utility companies with multiple assets, responsibility for different things on the highway, and where there's a difference in land ownership, be it private forecourts or local authority or local housing associations having responsibility for certain estates. So it's trying to challenge, see what's out there in the public realm, and sort of manage the fact that you're going to get pretty much anything that you can imagine that's out in the public realm is going to come through to it at some point in some form.
Yeah, absolutely. And Sally, I'm going to jump back to you if I can, because when we had our prep discussion, you were describing the problem as you know, who owned what, whose responsibility was what, and you gave some great examples. Would you mind sharing those, you know, with the group now?
Yeah. So one of the things that's very specific to London is that from a highways perspective, Transport for London is responsible for some things and the boroughs are responsible for some things, which is generally based on geography. So Transport for London have a 580 kilometre road network, which is within Greater London, and then the 32 boroughs and City of London are responsible for the other roads. as a resident, you're not going to know necessarily who's responsible for what road. It's not always obvious.
You know, housing organisations, I mean, there's always issues when residents contacting a housing organisation. I've been on many phone calls where housing providers are confused with the local authority. You have managing agents in the mix. Tell us a little bit about the feedback loop issue from a housing perspective.
Yeah, there's a lot that resonates with what Jonathan and Sally said that totally fits in with social housing sector. You know, we could be talking about a block of flats with shared communal spaces, your corridors, your stairwells, your bin stalls, your parking. We could be talking about land where we've got shared communal green space, and over the years how land may have been divided up where some's local authority stock, some's now moved to social housing provider, changes in managing agent responsibilities. You can have a whole midst of whether it's a space or a space in which a service is delivered. So it might be my cleaning in that particular space, or it might be who's managing the security or the access point. So you can get this whole vast of issues come up that ultimately, as a resident living there, you see it as one. You see a problem, you want it fixed. As Sally said, you're not necessarily interested in, oh, I know that bit of land belongs to that partner, or for the cleaning, I now need to go to this subcontractor. That's not really something you want to spend your time doing. And I think part of the problem around accountability and responsibility when you're dealing with that as a landlord, it can feel very disjointed for the customer. There can be so much waste in reporting because you're going here, there and everywhere, and you either get over reporting or you get the other extreme of the spectrum, which is an apathy around, well, someone else will see it and someone else will do it, or I've reported it before and it's not been action quick enough. And you're there as the landlord in the mix, wanting to actually understand what attempts has been happening and what knowledge base there is. So yeah, multiple issues, I think made more complex because of the number of different partners you could have and finding that clarity.
Of that, really succinctly put. I've seen those issues in housing, you know, firsthand, and I like the way that the police tried to tackle it many years ago. You know, when you find abandoned cars, and of course you would get those posters on them now that says police aware, because of course you don't know how many reports, you know, people would get in, or like you say, there's this apathy, so nobody reports the car, but that little bit of visual management. But of course, you know, not always possible in the vast areas, you know, that housing and local authorities are dealing with. So Amelia, you have a more solutions focused perspective of the issue, given what you do with Society Works, and you've been developing software that Sally's mentioned, Fix My Street, that's used in local authorities, and you have it in a housing association as well. It's in early stages, so I won't name names.
Yeah.
If you want to know, contact Amelia directly. So can you wrap up this bit of the conversation by describing the themes of the problem that you see when talking to people in these sectors?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, because of us being a civic tech organization, we obviously approach this from a how can we use technology to solve these problems. So really, I mean, Fix My Street, it started as a completely kind of citizen focused. It was about enabling members of the public, this was 15 years ago, to be able to make reports online to their kind of local councils. And then within the kind of the last 10 years, that has very much been looking at the problems from both sides, rather than it being just about the members of the public, where you're looking at things like whether there is that kind of apathy, that if they engage, are they ever going to hear back? Is there any kind of trust in that kind of sort of process of the communications with themselves and the local authorities? And then from the council's perspective as well, obviously they, it's in their best interest, they're wanting that kind of sort of trust and to feel like that their communities feel kind of sort of engaged, that they can kind of have an effect. But also it's addressing issues like, how do you reduce that duplication in data, that when someone does make a report, what happens if you end up with like 1,000 reports on the same issue? There is that concern about what additional expense there could be if you are by bringing about kind of SLAs, which to have that encourage that kind of sort of feedback and having that sort of two-way flow of information. Is that going to increase costs in any way? Does it is there going to be any additional pressure? Because obviously what you're looking to do is to try and reduce costs in that process. So that's kind of all of the things that we were looking to address, you know, and that we've kind of continually worked to refine over the sort of the last 15 years.
Love that. That's fantastic. Thank you. So excellent. So that's sort of starting to talk about the problem a bit. And Sally and Amelia, you know, we've touched on the Fix My Street solution. I'd like to look a little bit more about the sort of solutions that organisations have explored, you know, because not everything can be fixed with technology. Technology is a fantastic enabler, right? But it can't fix everything that's truly broken. You know, we do a lot of the, you know, the cultural, the problem solving, the process element of this. So how do you create an effective feedback loop? Is the challenge predominantly sort of cultural, or is it more practical? Jonathan, can I start with you? Did you try other things before coming to Fix My Street? Was there some work you had to do before bringing in the software? Talk us through that journey a bit.
Well, I think we quite early adopters of Fix My Street. So we we set up an integration with Fix Street back in 2012, and at the time it was large growth in online reporting, but without anything sort of joined up to it. So you had a myriad of websites which would say, you know, report this issue, we'll fire off an email, and what you had was local authorities being bombarded with an email where there's a public email address, most often our contact centre, firing through an email saying, here's a fly tip, or here's a pothole, whatever it may be, and then you've got the contact center then manually logging that on or trying to pass that through, and again sort of creating that bottleneck within the contact center. So what we sort of did with Fix My Street was really plug into the back office system and give it the power to the officers and the contractors who are actioning those to pass information back to the customer. And we did that through this is where you get into the cultural aspect, because part of that did involve looking at doing some support and training and reviewing our workflows, and making sure we had appropriate statuses within our back office system to reflect those different steps that you go through. So the idea we try to sort of take is that idea of getting a parcel delivered and you get those email alerts that sort of say your parcel's at the depot, your parcel's now with a dispatch driver, your parcel's 8 stops away, your parcel's been delivered. We wanted to try and take people through those steps, and that did require us to review our system, look at our workflows, put in place those statuses in the system. We could then map to updates back onto the Fix Street reports, and also do some training and support with our officers, because it was a bit of a cultural shift from being a little bit sort of arm's length, where something gets passed through to you from the contact center and then you're out doing it and you might give an update on it if someone chases for it, to suddenly you've got to manage this from start to finish and take through the updates to sort of say, yes, it's been fixed, yes, it's been attended, and doing that. Technology has been great as we've been moving forward. We've been able to automate more of that process and make that slicker, doing things such as link some of the contractual jobs in the system, so that once it's been passed to a contractor, when the contractor closes that job down, and they want to close it down because that's how they get paid, so that's part of their natural workflow process, that can then push back and update the inquiry, which then updates Fix My Street, which updates the customer. So in one simple act, you're going through sort of 3 or 4 stages and getting that information back to the customer, and hopefully closing that feedback loop. And I think one of the big changes it meant that we're now managing each report that comes through to us to a point of resolution. So it's not just off into the ether, and you know, I might find it's fixed if I go out to the location and see what's happened, but we will manage something to a point of close, whether that's saying we can't do anything about it, or we don't think we need to do anything about it, or whether it's saying all done, cleared away, repaired, but there's a point of resolution that we will come to on that report.
Brilliant. That sounds ideal. Jeanette, you don't have Fix My Street or anything like that, as far as I know, in Golding. Tell us a little bit about how you tackle that challenge, the things that you've done and are doing in Golding homes.
Yeah, I think that those sort of IT tools are lacking a little in the sector, but seeing demos of how local authorities have used it has worked really well. But I think in terms of culturally, there has got to be that want and the value around what does that good look like, that it is that we're aspiring to something is, and if it's in sync with other managing agents or landowners that you're going to be working towards similar expectations and thresholds there. So I think that's part of that communal space management as well. But very practically, you know, you need things in place that are going to enable colleagues to know where to look for the right answers. If it's not an IT solution, you know, have we got the right maps in place that tell us about land ownership or responsibilities? Have we got service level agreements with the partners who are working on estates? You know, we can set up new developments where we know we're going to be working with managing agents. Let's get the SLAs set out right at the outset that are available. We know where they are. We know how we can share them as a tool to our colleagues and our customers as well. And that's something, I think, having information at your fingertips to enable you to manage space well is always a frequent problem that comes up quite often, which actually sounds like it should be a really easy one to fix, or to know how to put the steps in place to fix it. I think other tools that we've used, you know, sometimes it's not always about the responsibilities of a contractor or a local authority, but responsibilities of a resident equally. And you know, we have to quite often then have to come back to a resident and work on resolutions that are about, these are our responsibilities and here are yours. You know, how can we prevent these problems happening in the first place? You can report things that get dumped in a communal area, but how can we take a step back and say, right, how can we stop that problem from happening? So some of our feedback loop is about prevention. Can we do those communal charters? Can we design out a problem? Sometimes that feedback loop is about, well, what's next, so that we can have a different response going forward, and when using that intelligently.
Absolutely, very clear roles and responsibilities. You know, however you cascade that information across an organisation can really help massively. You know, who is ultimately accountable for this liaison, even if you're not accountable for that response. And you're right, you can only hold people to account for things that are known. So your comment about the resident, it's almost the what do they say? There's the unknown unknowns. Is that the phrase? It's something like that. You know, how can you act on something you don't understand? So being really clear about, in the estate, this is your responsibility, this is your responsibility, this is your responsibility. Having it documented out somewhere. It reminds me of the, you know, these disputes you get over fence panels, right? It's come down, it just lays there, and nobody does anything, not because they don't want to, because nobody knows who's supposed to do something. Is an interesting point that I've badly articulated. So I'll move on quickly. Amelia and Sally, I mean, can one of you talk a little bit more about how that process works from Society Works point of view? How do you get the system? Sounds fantastic, but what do you do about the front end with the processes and and everything else to make sure it's optimum?
When you say about it, is it kind of how much of it is kind of cultural and kind of sort of technology? I mean, it's probably 50-50 both. So a lot of the time we can be, we will speak to a local authority or a transport organisation or a housing association, and really when that investigation sort of starts as to trying to look at the problems that need resolving, quite often the first things you're kind of highlighting are where these kind of grey areas are. So where there is kind of inconsistencies or a lack of knowledge or a lack of data, and it's kind of a lot of the time it's sort of acknowledging that especially when it comes to closing that feedback loop, that you acknowledge that it's a work in progress, that actually it will be a case of coming up with kind of a solution in terms of, you've got that kind of basic thing of trying to make sure that you've got kind of processes in place that are very kind of human, even when it's kind of sort of automated. So you're trying to remove kind of the kind of internal language and codes and things that just don't translate when they're going, sort of out in the outside world. But then also it's thinking about things like the way in which you would communicate with people, if it's like an online posting versus the email they're receiving. And it's really a case of acknowledging that over a course of time that will need to be monitored, and looking at the use of language, whether there's any kind of confusion, whether things are kind of sort of understood internally within sort of that network between contractors and sort of agencies and authorities, whether that's that they are the same words and phrases that are used by members of the public, or whether there's we even see it when we're kind of sharing best practice and things with different parts of the country. There is huge kind of shifts in the way kind of language is used and different things like that. So it's sort of acknowledging that there isn't ever a right, we'll just put these things in place and then that's the right kind of sort of solution. you know, we covered it, understanding that really, as long as we can eliminate it being an additional workflow, so it really comes down to kind of integrating systems, that when those decisions are made as to who are the right people to speak to, and, you know, which are the right kind of sort of key players at different times, we, you know, obviously getting those kind of integrations right, so that a report will never go to the wrong, you know, is not going to any of the wrong places. So you're cutting down on all that kind of sort of wasted time, or reducing that kind of duplication of data. But then it is a case of just, yes, kind of continually reviewing that process of the way in which members of the public are being communicated to.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you so much. Okay, so let's move on to a couple of the questions. So we had 2 questions that we actually received sort of multiple variations of the same thing. So I'll start with the first one. And so how do you manage communal queries where there is more than one stakeholder involved? So we've talked about multiple stakeholders, haven't we already? Different people needing to be involved. So for example, managing agents or private landlords. So you might have guessed this question comes from housing, who need to collaborate. So you ensure the resident doesn't get lost. So an issue that comes in where actually the query comes to you, but it's for someone else. How do you deal with that and make sure, you know, the resident doesn't get lost in this? And Jonathan, can I start with you?
I think it's always an ongoing process. You can sort of deal with some of the processes internally, and then the workflows, and then there's always sort of the next sort of chapter, to looking at those bodies, you know, immediately outside of your control, and that you have stakeholders and partnerships with. I think it's part of a process of trying to catch that information as you go along, and store it centrally. I think quite often you find things have occurred, and it's not the first time they've ever happened. This probably happened 6 months ago, 6 years ago, and it got dealt with, and a resolution was found. But how did that get resolved? Who had responsibility? Who sort of did sort of things, and what was the arrangement around it? And quite often it's trying to get a formalized process between you and your stakeholders that isn't reliant on, I've got a good contact there, let me give Joe Bloggs a shout, and I'll have a chat with them, and we'll work out what's happening. Because it might get that resolved today, but in a year's time that pops up again, and they're no longer working in that department or for the organization, and suddenly you're back at the sort of the door, kind of knocking on, going, who do I see to try and get this sort of taken forward? So I think a lot of it is trying to capture that information where it works, document it for colleagues to be able to look at and share, and build sort of best practice processes. And that's where I think starting to use the tech options to see if you can capture that information, hold it digitally. I think that's where things such as GIS layers, where you do sort of come to an agreement of, right, we've got responsibility for cutting this bit of grass, and your guys are going to cut that verge over there. Let's get that documented in a GIS map. Let's get that loaded into the system, so that at the point of reporting, it's going to go to the right people. It's going to go to the right team, rather than it sort of goes back to someone who's going to reinvent the wheel, potentially, kind of going, well, this isn't us. I'll go to land registry and do a whole search and all that sort of stuff. So it's very much an ongoing process, but I think a big part of that is trying to just catch where we have got success. How can we make that a knowledge bank for not just us but our stakeholders, and share that? And if we can we put a digital solution in that helps retain that information for our colleagues?
I like that. It's almost like the 80-20 rule, right? 80% of the queries will relate to 20% of those stakeholders. So you have formalized processes in place for dealing with that, and the rest you tackle as and when. And like you say, if you record that information, then you've got it to come back to, which is brilliant. And Jeanette, this was an issue that was raised by social housing. I know it's a common thing in social housing. Tell us a little bit. I mean, you've already talked about effective SLAs with partners and organisations you're working with. Are they enough? Are they effective? Is there anything else we could be doing?
Yeah, I think, yeah, the description of the knowledge bank that Jonathan said there is absolutely, I mean, I think that's absolutely key. You know, that's the practical guides that you need to be relying on. You need to be keeping up to date. You know, I'm working in areas of managing agents are changing, and actually that feedback hasn't come through to the right teams or services. It's ever evolving, and I think thinking about in your own organisations, where's the central point where we're accountable for keeping things updated? I think we can get disjointed in our approaches in one organisation, let alone working across multiple organisations. So I think, you know, we need to think smartly about internally, how do we make sure the information and updates we're receiving, whether it's through our cleaning teams or our tenancy teams or our shared ownership teams who are working closely with a particular manager and agent, that we're feeding this information through. We've got this constant live feed. But I think as well, where there is that more than one stakeholder, and ultimately as a landlord, if a resident's paying a service charge through to ourselves, they see us as accountable for helping answering their questions and getting the jobs done. I wouldn't want to be seeing our customer moving around all these different partners. I want to see them sort of central to that, us doing the work in the background if we haven't got the IT support solutions, but us in the background working to find the answers that essentially the customer needs, and being able to deliver that or keep them updated and deliver it with that time speak. So I think, yeah, it can be very much have its dependencies on the IT and funds you have available to support your solutions for this. But fundamentally, I think coming back to agreeing who are your owners within your organisation, culturally, how do you want the customer experience to feel, where are you going to cut down on the waste in your process, and remembering your colleagues on the front line as well, who are there trying to answer these questions, because they quite often in a similar place to some of our customers.
Brilliant. And I know some organisations, both local authorities and housing, that have got like scheduled prompts, almost like CRM system, where it prompts them that even if they've not had a response, they need to go back to the customer, right? But you're right, it's all about that customer journey, that customer experience. And just because you don't have the answer right now, the alternative is to leave people hanging and get them to contact you, which we know would be failure demands. Actually, it's that proactivity that people value. Sometimes these really complicated queries take a long time to answer, but being proactive can make the difference between a really good experience for someone and a really bad one. So yeah, that's something we've seen in other places that really works. Sally, tell us a little bit about in the highways agency, what this was like.
Yeah, one of the key customer complaints that we used to get was that somebody would call the contact centre with a problem, and the contact centre would say, "This isn't our responsibility. You need to speak to whoever, utility company, borough," and the customer doesn't want to do that. I often, we did used to find that quite often customers don't care who is responsible for fixing a thing. They just want someone to fix it, or even to just know that someone's fixing it.
Completely. Totally agree with you there. You don't care, do you? I had an issue with my broadband recently. It was through an unnamed provider, although I'd love to name them. And we couldn't get the connection set up. It was this new super fast thing, and I would call up for an update, and they go, "Yeah, but it's them," and then I'd say, "I don't care," because they've got a million subcontractors as well. My contract's with you. I just need to get it sorted. And it was the most frustrating experience. That knowing who's accountable and who just needs to give those updates is really important. And what that whole experience told me is even the massive companies in this country, and this was obviously a very, very big provider of wireless and phone networks, can't get it right. Right? Can't get it right. And trust me, my incident wasn't that much of a stranger. It was fairly commonplace with a new network being rolled out across the UK. So yeah, you're absolutely right. The customer doesn't care. They just want a resolution. They want to be kept updated as well. Excellent. Amelia, anything else to add from Society Works' point of view on that issue of multiple stakeholders?
No, I mean, the only thing that I would say is obviously we obviously approach this from a technical perspective. So what we are always trying to do is kind of sort of eliminate things like, for example, it's really important to get a good sense of how much data is available, where the inconsistencies are, and where you can use things like asset data, for example, anything that would minimize you're kind of deciding whether or not the member of the public is to be notified that this particular contractor that's dealing with this, or in the case of kind of local authorities, whether it's actually this grass cutting is dealt by the parish or whatever. So you sort of make that decision as to how much information you're providing the end user, and then it's that kind of sort of commitment really as to yes, kind of managing that process. It's not necessarily about them having to see a resolution. It's about, can we put things in place like asset information, for example, that prevents that contractor having to go out and assess which street light it is or whatever. So you're kind of reducing down, that kind of assessing time, and at the same time being able to kind of update them, how much can be done, or in an automated way, just to keep everyone updated as to who that problem is now sitting with, and then it comes back and it goes off, because quite often it takes a few different players to carry out kind of assessments on particular work, or for something to come to a resolution. So it's just about kind of, yes, how much technology can resolve those things, and and if it can be done whilst balancing that, it'd be amazing if some technology can do everything, but it costs millions and millions of pounds. Then it's not worth anything to anybody. It's about being able to do things, in a kind of cost-effective way, that it actually kind of brings about savings as well as improving processes.
Absolutely, the value of the software, has to equate to the cost, doesn't it? There has to be a balance there. Yes, absolutely. Brilliant. If everybody's happy, then I'm going to move on to our second question theme, which we've been touching on as we've gone, which is that it can be difficult to strike the right balance between providing too much information and too little information. So what strategies or tools, and obviously I expect Fix My Street to crop up here, do you recommend to enable customers to receive and have access to the right level of information, the right communication levels at the right time, so you don't overload them with information or communication? I'll start with Jeanette, if that's okay. Would you like to give your thoughts?
Yeah, I think on the too much, you just think back to the experience of some residents often getting quite a number of different letters, or seeing lots of different posters on display, or that overkill of information, which might have contradicting messages, or be a duplication of messages from one organisation from different teams. I'm thinking of examples where we might have a fire safety communication wanting to go out in a block at the same time as a cleaning update, at the same time as something that's happening on the land, and the green land in front of your building. And I think that overload of too much information in the wrong time, or in the wrong formats, or the wrong tone, or the wrong language, just means it's not accessible. It's not something that people are going to digest. They're not necessarily going to act on that in order to give them what they need to do what they want at the right time when they need it. So I think there is that balance around coordinating what residents need to know. What's important to them, what they want at their fingertips to be able to enjoy where they live and help manage the space where they live. Having that centralised, can it be accessible for the resident when they want it? So is it a web-based tool? Is it something on a portal? Can I, if it could be the Fix My Street, and it could be something that a landlord could provide in their own communications around their accessible tools as well. So I think it's about the right format and the right method for the right information you're trying to communicate, and trying to streamline that as much as possible. And if you have got known partners, I know I've worked on projects where we know who our key stakeholders are in an area. Can we join up what our programme of activity might look like this year, so we've got some clear communications going forward? Or can we learn what the most commonly reported issues are in a particular area, so that going forward we can do a bit more upfront promotion around, right, when you have this problem, this is what we need you to do, or we can do that call to action so that we can make it much more smoother as well.
I love that, especially that idea of residents being able to pull the information that they want, rather than having information sort of pushed onto them, which can feel quite overwhelming, right, when 10 letters drop through the letterbox. But housing organisations, local authorities, if you're involved in social services, all these other things that we're involved in, gas and electricity, that's a lot of different portals to log on to, isn't it? So I do sometimes wonder if, instead of having, I'll take my communications electronically please, but having to log on to all these different places, I sometimes wonder, but I won't because it's not the green alternative, whether it'd be better just to have everything land on my doormat, because at least it's all there in one place. But yes, no, totally get your point. Really interesting. Jonathan, how about you in local authority?
Yeah, I think it's trying to strike that balance. I think what it's really that trying to do is you're right, not give too much information at the first point. People don't tend to read through and go through a manual of who's responsible for different assets. And we've tried to work with Society Works to as much as possible, make the process strip out those bits without the customer needing to sort of know that information. So the example sort of Sally gave earlier around, say, traffic lights or a bus stop, it might be based anywhere in the borough of Bromley, but it's TfL who are taking that forward, so that the user's putting that information on the system, and that's going straight off to TfL without coming into Bromley's remit. But the customer is just going off. They haven't had to work out and determine who's responsible for that, particular asset. It's just done for them. Outside of that, obviously GIS layers are useful. Again, trying to use the system not to have the customer have to read through pages and find out who's responsible, but just it does it in the background for them. But also make it as easy as possible to get information through to us in a quick and coherent way, because often there can be complex issues that we need to assess before we can even work out who might be responsible. We might need to go and check, and actually that the cover is not very clear, and is it is it a water cover, is it a gas cover, is it a telecoms cover? That we don't expect the customer to know that and know the different types of covers, and then you've got covers that date back to the 80s, which with a name on which isn't reflected in the current provider or utility, or has been taken up by a parent company. So there's sometimes a lot of stuff that needs to be done and assessed by our team on site. So making it as easy as possible for the customer to get to the core information over to us, and then we can have one of our officers go out, check the situation, and then hopefully communicate as clearly and concisely back to the customer to advise, we've done an inspection, this bit is us, we're going to take that bit forward, this bit is for this utility, we'll let them know about that, and we hope that they'll attend as quickly as possible. So it's trying to make it as smooth as possible, use a system where we can, but yeah, not overload the customer. And also we try to use hierarchies in our reporting. So rather than have sort of one list of sort of 60 or 70 things, you're sort of scrolling down to find the right thing that corresponds, and the customer won't. The customer will pick the first thing that seems to sort of align with what they want to sort of do. But if we can try to make it sort of a stepped process of it's to do with something on the road, and then we've got a subcategory, okay, is it to do with this or this, and hopefully steer the customer through. So without making the customer have to educate themselves into who's responsible, we can try and just nudge them through that process and kind of go, right, that's the one. And in the back of the system kind of goes, right, I've got this information, I've got these two hierarchies, that needs to go over to that team.
Fantastic, thank you. And I suppose Sally and Amelia, so Fix My Street is software that does this. How do you ensure? I'm guessing that the approach is on-demand communications, or does it push out communications? How do you get that balance right?
Well, I think the first thing is that we, from the outset, we definitely acknowledge that, I mean, it would be the same with housing associations, local authorities, that from a distance, these organisations look the same. Even when they have the same, line of business systems in the background, they will not be configured the same. So we kind of approach it with that same mindset. So we kind of know that everyone that we work with will have different workflows. They'll, it isn't a case of us going in and saying, right, this is how you need to be managing how those reports and those things come out. So really, through best practice and advising, I mean, we have the benefit of working within an industry. No one is competing against each other. So the ability to be able to, bring councils together or bring organisations together to share best practice and give advice and speak to each other is what hones that and makes it kind of, work as well as it, as well as it can do. And it's understanding things like, just because a back office system will have kind of multiple updates with regards to one report, it's being able to kind of sit with someone like Jonathan, work out actually which of those are relevant to update a member of the public. The rest of those are more relevant to the kind of internal players that are dealing with that reporting process. So it's just kind of that understanding that it is never going to be a one size fits all. It will be the same even within that authority, depending on the type of problem that's being dealt with as well. Sometimes with particular things that maybe are very kind of contentious or whatever, that there's a lot of kind of sort of traffic of people kind of looking for feedback. It would be probably more beneficial to stop that, those kind of phone calls coming through, to make sure there's kind of regular updates coming through. Whereas that other stuff, where it is your kind of sort of regular day-to-day things that people are reporting, just a kind of a matter of course, where it's fine just to have those kind of triggered updated responses. So I think it's just about having that flexibility, really.
Yeah, and I think just keeping the updates short and succinct is really key. There's quite often, as you know, everybody said, there's a lot of things going on in the background, and you know, like Jonathan was saying, if something turns out to be the responsibility of a utility company, then in the background the highways team are issuing all kinds of notices and bits and pieces to the utility company. The customer doesn't really want to know that. They don't need the details, or, you know, that somebody's been issued a section 81. They're not interested. They just want to know that you've done a thing to fix it. And I think the key thing really is that when you're doing updates on things like defect reporting or fault reporting, your update shouldn't ever really be more than a couple of sentences. And if it doesn't answer the question that the customer has asked you, it's not a good update. If the language is so complicated that you yourself don't really understand it, or imagine if you gave it to your nan to read, would she understand it? If the answer to that is no, then it's not a good update. So it's getting that balance. And obviously there are complex issues which do require more detail, but it's getting that right. And if you use a digital solution, you can have all of your responses all set up. So everybody gets consistent responses. Obviously, there's always going to be times when you need to amend that, but I think it's just keeping the communication clear. And like you said, just not overloading people with information. You know, they just need a little bit. So one of the things that Fix My Street can do is, if you go to report a problem and there's some road work scheduled in that area, it will tell you that, because actually that might be quite useful for you to know. But it will only tell you that if you want to report a problem in that area. If you want to report it 4 streets away, then it won't tell you, because it's irrelevant. So it's just finding that balance of being informative but not overloading.
I love that about making sure you get the tone right for the customers. You know, we're all in sectors where we can fall into jargon, right? We love a TLA, 3-letter acronym in local authorities and housing, right? And it's not showing those, you know, to your customers, which can be so easy when you're just providing updates and things like that. And before I joined Adesi a long time ago, my background was in criminal justice, and I was always amazed by how highbrow we kept the language that went to offenders. Now, the stat is something like, now please, people watching, don't come at me if I've got this wrong, but I'm nearly there. It's something like 80% of offenders are illiterate, right? And yet we were sending very complicated, you know, letters and communications out to them, you know, that just wasn't tailored to them, and then wondered why we got phone calls and queries and you know, communications back. So yeah, making sure it's simple, it's appropriate, we avoid jargon. Yeah, absolutely agree. Really important, you know, to do that. If we give people a response in 1 line, do it. Yeah, don't need to write an essay. You're not justifying your time or your cost here. Just do it. So yeah, fantastic answers. Thank you. And do you know what? I'm afraid this is pretty much all we've got time for. In fact, I'm looking at the clock now. I'm in danger of overrunning with you lovely people that have given your time to us. But what I want to say is a huge thank you to you all for spending your time with us today and for all of your input and insights. And I'd like to finish now by inviting Amelia to show us a little bit of the Fix My Street system itself.
So I'll just keep this quite simple, because at the end of this, we'll be able to show up a link for the showcase site, which renews every 24 hours. So anyone can just go on and have a play and kind of, you know, have a kind of sort of dummy play of it. But I thought I'd show Bromley site, seeing as it was, as Jonathan was here. So this is obviously sort of the home screen of going into on the Bromley Council page. And if you scroll down, you can see just in the last week alone, they've dealt with 3,000 reports coming through. So if you imagine, it's really, really important to have, you know, an online digital solution that's working in a way to kind of ease that process as much as possible. So if you're a member of the public going in and you want to make a report, you obviously would just put in your postcode. It's obviously a map-based solution. And as we've been talking all the way through, this is very much about trying to take away any expected knowledge from the member of the public, you know, making the report. So really it is just a case of going in, being able to choose a location on the map, to be able to kind of make report a problem. So it is that simple. They would choose a location on the map, or they're obviously putting in their postcode, and they will be given a selection of categories to choose from, and then based on, obviously with Bromley being a London borough, based on the category they choose, immediately then there is a chance that report will be sort of immediately triaged elsewhere, because it isn't it's sort of understood that it's not a Bromley issue. So for example, if someone was to click on an abandoned Santander cycle, they click continue. So you can see here immediately that kind of communication cycle has sort of started. They're not interrupting, that we're trying to reduce that failure demand, and you don't want to prevent that kind of sort of reporting process. So you can see immediately there on the left hand side, it tells the person that this is actually a TfL issue, and they can obviously carry on making their report as following. So it really is that simple. And obviously members of the public, if they're going on and this is a report that's already been made, they can subscribe to existing reports to get the sort of feedback and updates that way. So we're trying to kind of minimize the amount of duplicate reports that would be coming through for exactly the same issue. For example, like with kind of sort of car parks and premises, if there's something that needs reporting that multiple people a day are having coming into contact with, you're trying to reduce that report down to one, with just as many people as possible being able to kind of sign up to it. What I'll do is I'll jump to just an example that I've looked at this morning. So you can have a look at how that kind of sort of feedback process works. So just obviously a simple thing such as grass cutting being reported in Bromley, you can see down this left hand side the process that has obviously taken place. On the 1st of November, a member of the public contacted the council with a couple of photos, just asking for the grass cutting team to obviously sort of see to that part of the area. And then you can see these automatic updates that have come through. You obviously have that initial acknowledgement that is triggered from the council system, acknowledging that the report has come through. They then have a second notification on the 3rd of November saying that the contractor has been notified. So from a member of the public's point of view, they're very much kind of sort of engaged with understanding what is happening as that process, and why things are taking the amount of time that they are. With a further update on the 7th of November, and then on the 15th of December, there is that kind of resolution to show that that work has been done and carried out. It's exactly the same if you look at issues, for example, with this one, with tree branches overhanging a property. Now there are rules and regulations as to when trees can be cut back. So people, member of the public may be putting a report like this sort of back in May. That already we would know that is not something that's going to be resolved straight away, because the council wouldn't be able to send someone out to cut that back until obviously kind of like the nesting season is over and everything for breeding season for birds. So you can see that these, that regularly each month there is an update on this system to show the person that has made the report, or anyone else that perhaps would be coming in, to make a complaint about the same tree, that process is in hand, it isn't being forgotten. So you're just trying to eliminate that chance of anybody picking up the phone to kind of sort of make a complaint as well. And then you can see all of, as soon as it's kind of issued to the contractor as to what's happening, what the process is. The only other thing that I'll show you is this is what the showcase site looks like. So you'll be able to, at the end of this sort of video, you'll be able to click on a link and be able to go through. But this is kind of sort of a free site to use, that you can just go in and sort of have a play around, create reports, create kind of different sort of user profiles and have a look at it. But yes, it updates every 24 hours, so it'll kind of reset, so you can sort of have a play around. The only other thing I'd say is to bear in mind is that all of the software that we create is made open source, so our code is freely available. What councils like Bromley pay us for is to kind of host and manage these services, but that isn't something that is ultimately required. You can actually, yes, download the code and kind of develop the systems and set up the systems independently.
Love that, Amelia. The social purpose behind the organisation really shining through there. Thanks so much for doing the demo. We will put a direct link to Amelia's contact details on this video, hopefully on screen now. somewhere. And yeah, the demo site as well. So thanks ever so much for your time today. If anybody has any questions about the system, get in touch with Amelia, or about anything else, feel free to drop me a DM.